Plato is the one of the fathers of Western philosophy. Some argue that, or it's been said, and many would agree with this, myself included, that all of philosophy really is a footnotes to Plato. And some would dispute that and say Aristotle makes not just footnotes but great advances on Plato, and there's no doubt about that. But I like the phrase, and I think there's some truth in that this man Plato, with whom we're going to spend this morning looking at least one of the important dialogues, the Republic, he is the one that in his main protagonist to his dialogues, because there's always a couple of speakers, but his main protagonist's name is Socrates, a man who really did live but never wrote anything. And that in itself is of interest. Some later on in the 19th century, writers will connect Socrates and Jesus for their influence on history, and make the interesting observation that neither Jesus nor Socrates ever wrote anything down, but had a huge influence nonetheless, which is interesting. I mean, I think the similarity ends there, more or less, to some degree. But nonetheless, this figure of Socrates looms large in Plato's thought. And who's doing philosophy here? You doing it concurrently with this? You'll find it helpful if you are, because I assume you're doing some of Plato's dialogues in that. Yes, okay, but probably not the Republic, because it's big and it's pretty meaty and hard to address in first year if you're trying to get through a wide variety of material. And that's one of the reasons why it's on this course in literature. Not that I regard it as literature, but because what we are looking at today has been vastly influential on literary studies. And it involves the moment in Plato's dialogues when he goes after the poets, famously. And to give the plot away, he says in his Republic, this book, that in his ideal republic, the poets would be voted off the island, to use the analogy of whatever that stupid show is where you get voted off the island. What's it called again? Survivor, yeah. So the poets would not be survivors, they're gone. And this is interesting because in Plato's day, Homer was regarded, whom we've just looked at, Homer was regarded as the teacher of all Hellas. And Hellas is the word that the Greeks used to describe themselves. So Homer, the teacher of all Hellas. That was what he was known as, and this tells us something about the education, the form of education, and the influence of this particular poet, one of whose works we spent at least a few classes on. Homer was recited in public gatherings, and these were obviously not just places of entertainment, although there was obviously a great deal of entertainment involved there, but instruction. So Homer, if you will, was the Bible, like the Bible of the Greeks. A great deal of wisdom and knowledge were disseminated in an appealing form. And to this day, I do believe that much of what we learn is learned through entertainment, what we call entertainment, but we separate usually from the dissemination of information. That divide between knowledge and entertainment, which has given rise in the 20th century to what we call the entertainment industry, which they say is not presenting a moral agenda or any form of teaching. Well, this view, which you hear commonly, Homer would not have agreed to, neither would Plato, neither would anyone else throughout the course of Western history, actually, until very recently. And this was so much so the case in Plato's day that the poets were the educators. People would cite Homer to make a point, to talk about the nature of a good civic life, they would look at how Homer portrays it, hospitality and how to act in public, what good moral conduct is, how to behave towards the gods, what the nature of the gods is, what the nature of the underworld is, all those sorts of things you would find in Homer. And so Homer occupied this place of being a great educator, and I said to you that the epic had a function of Paideia. Now this word Paideia I present to you not just because I like writing Greek words down, and I've written a whole bunch of Greek words down here. This word Paideia is used in the New Testament. In Ephesians 6 verse 4, where it says to fathers that they are to educate their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, depending on the translation, or the nurture, and I can't remember how it's rendered, but Paideia and nouthesia are the two words that are used. So this word for education there, the nurture of the young, the education of the young, is one that Paul himself appeals to. It's a Greek word. He uses the Greek word, and it's the Greek word that the Greeks of Homer's and Plato's day would also have used. It refers to a vast cultural realm. It's not just classroom teaching, it's behavior. So it's a broader sense than what we're doing right now. You're in a university. We tend to think of this as abstract, not applied, and that's true in a university context. This is very abstract in the sense that it's not, we don't go from my classroom to go out and put this into practice. I mean, hopefully that does happen, but it's not my aim here. But in Plato's day, this word Paideia includes all of that. Not just disseminating information, but teaching you how to live. That's really what is involved in Paideia. And Homer taught them how to live. So it's moral teaching, it's religious teaching, it's all of those things. And it was disseminated through these entertaining books that we call epics. So I need to say that first of all, because it explains why Plato is hostile to Homer, because it's not that he's not entertained by what he's reading. He plainly is, because everyone is. But he thinks that what Homer teaches is problematic for all sorts of reasons. But the main reason is that Plato agrees with other writers of his day and speakers of his day in saying that the way that the gods are portrayed is immoral. They do immoral things. They lie, they cheat, they steal, they commit adultery. They do all manner of things which are reprehensible and act like immortal children, basically. They have temper tantrums that last for years, and they're required to be appeased, and they seem to have psychological issues. And this cannot possibly be. Not for Plato. So when Homer writes about the things that are of ultimate importance, we can't trust him. And he doesn't know about the things he's talking about. And people are citing Homer as an authority when, if we ask them what they know, we find they don't know much. Now, this process, which plays out in all of Plato's dialogues, as I say, has Socrates as the central figure. And Socrates does something called dialectic. Where is it here? Dialectic, which is the means by which he asks questions of people. And famously, Socrates claimed to know nothing. He went around and said, all I know is that I know nothing. I need somebody to teach me. Who will teach me? And then he went to the people of the day who were reputed to be teachers and asked them questions and said, I am coming to you because I've heard that you know a lot about this subject and the teachers would say, oh yes, I really do. And they'd be happy that they're being recognized because, of course, if you're recognized as having expertise, then people are going to pay you. And they wanted to be paid. So Socrates comes to them. And what he then did through his questions would be to expose the ignorance and the hypocrisy of the teachers. They would end up in a dead-end street where they ended up having to stop talking. So they claim to know something, and after a few pages in Plato's dialogues, they're basically gibbering and sputtering, and they can't say anything more. And they are angry at Socrates and want to punch him in the nose. And they literally say that. You know, Socrates, I just want to punch you in that little pug nose of yours and beat your head in. Like, literally, they're hostile and angry to him. And so much so that, and this is borne out by historical evidence, Socrates himself was forced to drink hemlock because he was accused, hemlock, which is a poison, because he was accused of blasphemy in what he said about the gods. And he was leading the people of Greece, the young, away from the virtuous path of living. So this is what he was accused of. And yet, for Plato, he's a heroic figure because he was actually pursuing true knowledge rather than simply accepting what was taught by the authorities and those who were lining their pockets. And those that lined their pockets weren't Homer. Homer is no longer alive, but chiefly figures called the Sophists. Those are the ones that Socrates chiefly is taking issue with. Now, the Sophists are the wise. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. Sophia is the word for wisdom. And the Sophists claim to be wise. And so he went to the wise, claiming he knew nothing, and found out the wise very quickly couldn't answer his questions. So that's the general gist of Plato and Socrates in this. So he was, as I say, he was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens by profaning the gods, and therefore he's leading to blasphemy, and therefore he's going to have to die. Or he can go into exile. That's his choice. He chooses to drink the hemlock rather than be exiled, which is interesting also, but that would take me too far away from today's lecture. Question or comment?
So were Plato and Socrates together?
Plato was Socrates' pupil.
Oh, okay.
Socrates went around, and there were other figures that followed him and listened to him and were moved by him. So Socrates was the older man, and Plato was a young man watching and listening to Socrates, and he was so moved by what he heard and eventually by what he saw, namely that this man was executed for his path of wisdom, that he started writing dialogues that had Socrates as the main speaker. As Socrates doesn't write them, but Plato writes them. And then the question is, how much of it is Plato's contribution, how much of it is Socrates? We don't know exactly where that line is. But he's not the only writer that refers to Socrates, by the way. There are others that write dialogues based on Socrates. And the name just evaded me. I've read some of these, but I've drawn a blank. But so he's a famous figure, testified to by other. He's also a figure of fun in some of the comedies, Greek comedies of the day. Socrates is one of the figures. So he's a well-known Athenian figure. And lest you think that he's only a philosopher, he also would have fought in the military. He was an Athenian. So he did his duty. By the way, that was expected of anybody in the city-states of Greece. Up to the age of 60, you had to be ready for combat. You had to keep your body physically fit because you might have to defend the city against its hostile neighbors. And if you didn't, you'd end up being a slave. Right? That was the price of losing in the ancient world. You become enslaved. Yes?
So Plato used dialectic, like Socrates-style dialectic manner to attack Homer's points of view?
Well, no. His opponents are almost always the Sophists. Almost always. But here in the Republic, so I'll answer your question in a second here. The Republic begins as a discussion. I'm going to spend the whole class on one dialogue, which is 10 books, and I'm going to go over the whole of 10 books, and I obviously can't do that very well. But the Republic is about justice. What is justice? And he brings forward a man by the name of Thrasymachus. I'll write the name down, because I've only asked you to read a little snippet. Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus is a sophist. Thrasymachus claims that justice is what is the powerful getting their own way. That's what justice is. Which is what we hear regularly in our day. The rich and the powerful getting what they want, that's what justice is. So in other words, it's not justice, it's what people call justice, when really it's the powerful and influential getting the outcome that they want in the courts. That's justice. Now, does he think that that's real justice, or does he think that's often the outcome of the judicial process? He thinks that it's both. That's justice. In other words, he doesn't think that there is such a thing as justice. Right? When the rich and the powerful go to court, they hire better lawyers and they'll outspend you or whatever, and they'll end up being acquitted, and that's justice. So it's the rich and the powerful getting their way. He decides that that is what justice is. And for many, particularly in our day in the social justice movement, that's exactly what they say. This is the view of the Sophists, I might add. Plato, and Socrates in particular, is not going to accept that that is the case. This is not justice. This is a travesty of justice, which might be a regular outcome of the judicial system, but that is not justice. It can't be. And so the argument of the Republic is Socrates beginning with this fellow Thrasymachus, who claims that justice is the rich and the powerful getting their way, and Socrates starts asking him questions. How do we know what justice is then? How do we appeal to this? How do we sense injustice if that's what justice is? Do I have a concept of the justice, of what justice is? And if not, why am I offended when I am treated unjustly? Everyone knows what justice is. You say it's the rich and the powerful getting what you want, but then why are we offended and think that this is unjust? Because we have a clear idea of what justice is. And that's why we feel an injustice. And he could ask your kids about this if you ever have them. A small children will know what just and unjust is. If you want an experiment on this, ask kids to divide cake up. Right? And if you ask the stronger one to do it, the stronger one would cut the cake so they had a bigger piece, and the smaller one would get the smaller one. The smaller one would be outraged at the injustice. If you want to fix the problem there, you get one to cut it and the other to choose the first piece. And then they will spend 5 minutes, making sure they exactly measure it so it's precisely divided down the middle. Because they know they get to do the cut, but the other person gets to choose. So they're going to be very, very scrupulous in being just in the cutting. But if they thought that they could cut and choose, then they would get a big piece, and their little sibling would get this little microscopic piece, and the little sibling would be outraged because everyone understands the inequity of injustice. It's clear, and that's Socrates' point. We have a clear, distinct idea of what justice is. So it's not an abstraction. It's not a word that the powerful use to get their way. It is a real thing. And this is what the Republic is about. It's about justice. Now, other of his dialogues are about other things, about the beautiful, about the good. And in fact, even in the Republic here, he's going to talk about the form of the good. What's the real nature of the good? What is the form of the good? Does this make sense? I think it's pretty clear. It's pretty easy, actually, as well, and straightforward, but quite powerful. Thrasymachus claims that it's just what he experiences. Plato or Socrates says, oh no, it's not. And you don't believe that either. You don't believe that. So, in book 6, he draws out, or he doesn't draw out, he describes what I've drawn out here on the board, and I've taken this from Grube's version of Plato's Republic. I can't remember the page number. Oh, yes, I can, because it's 164, if you're interested. This little diagram, now I've added to it, but I've derived it from that. And he gives an analogy for how the teachers of his day describe physical things. And they write their works, like Homer will write his book on the basis of what he sees. So this is a shadowy description of a physical description, but the physical description is not the real thing either. The real thing, so demonstrations of justice and injustice, he can describe injustices in the Republic, but what is the real nature of justice? For that we have to have the form of justice. What is the form of justice? What is it in its essence? What is its nature? That Homer never discusses. And he doesn't even know, he says. But the philosopher does. And so he's going to argue that the teachers of the ideal republic ought not to be the poets, but the philosophers. Now you could see this as a power move. I take him at his word, and I think he means it seriously. I think he is a true believer in the power of the mind and the rightness of justice, and how this is a scandal. But he really, this is about education. Who's going to be the teacher? Who's going to do Paideia? Who's going to educate the young? Is it people that believe in truth, or people that want to line their pockets? It's an issue in our day. If it were not, the schools would not be talking about social justice constantly. It's all the rage, right? I don't need to tell you that. You just come through the schools and everyone's talking about social justice. What do they mean by that? Power, privilege, all that business, right? In other words, the sophistic position. That's what they think justice is. This class is not to get into that. It's to give Homer's, or rather Plato's response to it. So his response is that actually, so here's the big division here. This is called the divided line, by the way, what I have here. But the big division is here, as it were. This is the realm that we see, and this is the realm that we can think about but not see. So you can't see justice. You can't see that sort of thing. You can't see the good. You can't see truth. You can't see beauty. You can see representations of those things, but you can't actually see those. And yet those things are necessary for us to appeal to them, even when we're talking, when we say, wow, she's beautiful. We have an idea of the beautiful when we talk about someone who is beautiful, right? And otherwise the word wouldn't mean anything. It would just be subjective. Well, I don't think so. But we do appeal to something, and when we do that, we actually mean what we say. No, I don't mean that I like her. I mean she's beautiful. There's something objective there. Now, I'll give you another illustration here. In the 80s, I'm an adult convert, so I didn't go through all this business. But in the 80s and 90s, there was something called the worship wars in churches. I inherited this as an adult convert, that these wars went on in churches where people shifted from singing hymns to doing choruses. And the churches were this was so controversial that churches split over it, right? And so some churches, like the Harvest churches, they don't even play hymns. They only play the contemporary lyrics, right? And I came into it after the fact and said, so you really divided churches over the matter of whether you prefer to sing this or that? Like what's going on there? That seems rather silly. Except that people were willing to do that, and they were absolutely unbending. It's going to be that way. Well, why? Because it has to do with perceptions of the beautiful. This is my idea of the beautiful, and I hold the beautiful to be, my idea of the beautiful to be true. And there's goodness in it. And so I don't think it's just a matter of subjective preference. I really think that this is beautiful and there's goodness in it. And so I'm going to fight tooth and nail to the end on it. And I think that that is how the true and the good and the beautiful work. So beauty is not separated from goodness or truth. I'm not taking sides on that, by the way. I have a clear side on it, and it's not with the contemporary stuff. Because I think that truth is conveyed through beauty and there's goodness in it, but then you can't leave the truth behind, and contemporary worship lyrics largely do. It's gibberish, but that will get me on a rant, and I will avoid going on the rant. But just to point out that nobody actually believes that their perceptions of beauty are just subjective. Everybody regards them as objective and agrees with Plato that there is an idea there, a form of the good which I perceive as beautiful, and I am going to fight over it. He says that's the way things are, right? It's just an illustration. But he says that we access those forms, the real reality. Remember, Christians will hold that the ultimate reality is God, whom we can't see. You can't see God. And yet he is more real than anything you can see. More real, not less real. There's a heaviness to God, a glory that is unsurpassable. Even though you can't see it, the knowledge of God surpasses that earthly knowledge, right? And so Plato is arguing for something that later Christian theologians are also going to agree with. And we'll find that as you go through your courses here, that the ideas that Plato seems to be speaking of, Christians will take Plato and his ideas and will baptize them with Christian truth, but say he's really made a point here. Anyway, but these are called the forms. So the forms are things that we can't see, but there's an intelligible realm. And when I say intelligible, I've written in Greek ta noeton. The word here that is in the middle of that is this Greek word nous, which is the word for mind. Now, a mind is not your brain. The mind is that part of yourself which can reason. But that when I say that part of yourself, it's not a physical part of yourself. It's a capacity that you have. Human beings are capable of reasoning. What part of us is that? Can you point to a physical part? No, I can't. It seems connected to the brain, but it's not the same as that. The brain's a physical object. I'm talking about a capacity. So the you, which uses the mind, that part of you, the mind's eye, if you will, is beholding these things. So you can do one of the ways you do this is through mathematical reasoning. Dianoia, through the mind. There are no such things, strictly speaking, as numbers. It's an abstraction, but you need numbers for mathematics. And mathematics, by the way, just to give another illustration, is strongly connected with beauty in the sense that music, the musical scale, the harmony, is mathematically precise. Absolutely exact. And many people who are good with music are good at math because the same faculties are being employed. But here, it's perceived as beauty, whereas here it's just purely abstraction. Yeah, but now I can hear or see something which I hear can analyze down to extreme precision. And there's no doubt about it. And so music is almost a demonstration of something we can't see, namely numbers. That it's true as well as beautiful. So it's not a subjective thing. It is demonstrable. And if it were not so, we couldn't teach music. And we wouldn't have objective responses to it. But anyway, so that's his observation. And by the way, the ancient world had a curriculum which eventually was passed on as the liberal arts curriculum, in which there would be the 7 liberal arts. There would be the trivium on the one hand and the quadrivium. The trivium were the 3 language arts: grammar, logic, or dialectic, rhetoric. The quadrivium were the 3 number arts: geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. Music was considered one of the forms of knowledge. Do you ever think of music as knowledge? They did. They thought musical instruction was an essential part of learning the way the world is. And in fact, Plato says that if you want to destroy a nation, you change its music, because thereby you're attacking its ideas of truth and justice. Just meddle with the music. I'll just leave that with you, because you could think of all sorts of things that have happened in music. I guess I talked about one earlier in the worship wars. I wasn't thinking of that directly, but there you go. Create great divisions with untold consequences. Anyway, he lays this out in the Republic, Book 6. So these are things about which we can know mathematical reason, or the forms: justice, goodness, beauty, truth, those things. We can know about these things, whereas the things that we see, physical objects, we don't actually know. We simply have opinions on them. Oh, I wiped out the O. There's opinions. Opinions. We can have opinions on those things. They will be opinions that are validated when this jibes with it. But make no mistake, the real thing are the things that we can't see. Comments or questions at this stage? And I'm going to come to the allegory of the cave, which is in Book 7. Does this make sense, what I'm saying? Powerful stuff. Are you confused on anything? If so, please do ask. If not, I will just proceed. No? It may take you time. You will have all sorts of questions here. So he lays this out in Book 6, that this is real knowledge, whereas this is merely opinion, and the ideas or the stories that are told on the basis of what we can see, which the poets tell, are not only not knowledge, they're as far removed from knowledge as can be. So he set that up. And the philosophers look at these things, in fact, spend their time, just like Socrates himself does, interrogating things and getting beneath the surface appearance and inquiring what the real nature of these things are. So what is justice? That's the question of the Republic. He also says one final thing before I look at Book 7 and the so-called allegory of the cave. He says that in the exploration of justice, the most important thing is what it is for an individual. What does it mean to be just? How can I be just? What is it to be just? But he says it's really hard to describe that on that microcosmic level, that really granular, close level. Let's pull back a bit and look at how it works out in a city-state. Let's talk about justice in a city. But the one is supposed to be an illustration of what justice is for the individual. He said, a better way of looking at this, but he says there's an analogy here. For an individual to be just is, let's look at how a city would be just. And now he'll talk about relations, social relations within that. So when he's going to propose at the end, which he will right now, that those who should be in charge are the philosophers, what he is saying actually is not a sort of an agenda for philosophers to take overall power. It's really to say that the reason ought to rule over the will and the passions. Because the passions are the body, and the mind, the reason, ought to rule over it. So that's what, to be just is to have your reason rule over your passions and to inform your bodies what they ought to do. That's what it is. That's what it is to be just. To be a just person is to be a rational human being and to always do what is good and just and beautiful and right. That is what it means to be just.
How do you really know what's beautiful and right?
You do know without even a hint of contradiction. That's what he says in his dialogues. Let's pursue this. And he then presents it. Now, having said that, I will say, okay, so I'm giving the case for the philosophers. The poet's response is that at the end of his dialogues, and that includes here in Book 10 of the Republic, but it's elsewhere, once he's ground his interlocutors into the ground and they're gibbering at him or wanting to punch his face in. He then tells a story or a myth to explain what he's talking about. So I think he resorts himself to poetry, having destroyed the poets. He then gives a sort of a myth to illustrate what he wants to say. So it's not that he's opposed to poetry or opposed to myth. He's opposed to the myths that Homer tells, because they're not based on reasoning. So he wants a rational mythology based on truth. Now, I would argue that really what he's leaning after here is what Christians will call theology. It's a true account of the way things are and the way God is in his nature. That's what he's really after. He doesn't have it. But that will fulfill his requirements. But maybe that's my perception of it, but it's not only my perception. C.S. Lewis seemed to think Plato was on to something as well. And if you read his Narnia books, so it's all in Plato. Doesn't anybody read Plato anymore? Further comments, questions? Okay, so let me go to the book 7 of the Republic then, and the allegory of the cave. And I'm going to wipe this out off the whiteboard here. Has everyone got this down? If not, it's too late. So I will wipe this out, and the reason why is I'm going to stick this up on the board. And if you would, I would like you to turn the light off at the back here, at least the one on the board here. And I think I can put this up here. There it is. So in book 7, he gives this allegory. And it's an allegory of a cave. And he says this is what life is like. So I'll read a little extract from that here. It's an unforgettable image, and it's the image of some prisoners in a cave. He says, and I'll just read it from it. He says, compare the effects of education and the lack of it upon our human nature to a situation like this. And now he gives this. Imagine men to be living in an underground cave. So these are the men. Living in an underground cave-like dwelling place, which has a way up to the light along its whole width. So way up to the light, they're down the cave, and the ascent to sunlight goes up here. There's a path that goes all the way up. So there's light coming down, but it's not very much light. It's at the end of the tunnel, but it's far away. So the light doesn't come from outside. The light comes from a fire which is at the back of the cave. That's the only means that they have of seeing, because the light up here is so far up that it's like they're in a dark basement and they can't see at all. Right? But if they walked up far enough, let's imagine your house had a long, long stairway, you could eventually start to see the light in the distance. Eventually you could get out into the light and you'd be blinded by the light, in fact. But that's what the scenario is. So they have spent this, the entrance is a long way up. The men have been there from childhood with their neck and legs in fetters. They're in chains. They can't move. So that they remain in the same place and can only see ahead of them. See these men? They're sitting here and they're looking at the cave wall here. And the fire there's a roadway across here, and figures are going along the roadway, back and forth along the roadway. And when the light hits those, it casts a shadow on the wall. And they look at the shadows on the wall and they think, that's reality, because that's what they observe all day long. The shadows on the wall. Now remember the illustration that I just gave, that he's given in book 6 of the Republic. They're looking at the shadows on the wall, which they think are the real thing, but actually they're just shadows of these things. And the light by which they see is not the real light, though. That's the point. So now he's illustrating what he's demonstrated in book 6. You got it? Does that roughly make sense? So light is provided by a fire burning some way behind and above them. Between the fire and the prisoners, some way behind them and on a higher ground, there is a path across the cave, and along this a low wall has been built like the screen on a puppet show. And there are men that go along here with all sorts of reproductions of animals, human life, and they watch this, and every day they observe this and they say, what's going on there. And they talk amongst themselves and they talk about that. Okay, so that's the opening image you have to have in your mind. And then he says, imagine that one of those men was released from his bonds and dragged out of the cave, kicking and screaming. Why? Because he's being taken away from reality. Like, what are you doing? And I don't see the shadows anymore. This is terrifying. Pulled out, and furthermore, when he's pulled out into the light is blinding. It's painful. So this is what philosophy is like, and how philosophers are responded to. He's talking about what happens to Socrates. Socrates is leading people to the light, away from the conceptions that are being taught amongst themselves by one of these guys who's a poet, who comes up with a story about the shadows, right? And oh, that's a great story. I love the way you tell that story about the shadows. But now he's being dragged away from that. He can't hear the story anymore. And the philosopher is leading him up towards the light. And what are these guys doing? They're really angry at the philosopher for disputing the shadow play on the wall. But once this man has gone up into the light and sees the light for what it is, he will no longer be able to go back down into the cave to his fellow prisoners and sit back down and watch the shadows, because he'll know they're just shadows. He can't be satisfied ever again. Right? So anybody who's been exposed to the truth will no longer be able to live with the lie. So they won't be able to live like Thrasymachus, who says that justice is merely the powerful among them agreeing what justice is and getting his own way. He won't be able to do it. Say that's false. That's not true. That can't be. I know better. And so he'll try and persuade the prisoners, out of love for the good and for the true, to reject what they can see with their own eyes and the way the world works and the social injustice. They're going to reject that. Or he's going to want them to do it, and to live justly and act wisely and know the truth. And they will hate him and want to kill him for it. So that's those interesting aspects there. Can you see how that would work? It's a great analogy. He will no longer be able to compromise because he knows the truth. They will hate him because they think that he is talking nonsense, because they don't know that, and that will include the poets who are amongst them. So that's the problem. That's the problem. And so then the question is, in the ideal republic, is who should be educating the young? Should it be one of these guys, Homer, or should it be one of the philosophers who's gone out into the light? Not only should it be a philosopher, he will say that the liar should be thrown out of the republic altogether. That's the most controversial. They should be gone because they are toxic to the truth. Yes?
Does he see any benefits?
Well, not in the dialogue. He doesn't talk about anything like that. Now remember, the Republic, and I said this a minute ago, the Republic is about what justice is, and on an individual scale. Saying, so you have to follow reasoning, which is unerring, and ignore the passions of your body, which can deceive you, including your eyes. Your eyes can deceive you. You may think you see something, you may judge on the surface, the basis of appearances, but we want you to make a just judgment. By the way, Jesus, when he says, judge not lest you be judged, which everybody throws back at Christians about, you're not supposed to be judgmental. That's true. Judgmental in the sense of condemning people to hell. But he also says you're to make a just judgment. How can you make a just judgment if there's no possibility for just judgments? There is. You have to see things the way God sees them, because he is just. That's what it means to make a just judgment. Look at the world through the eyes that God gives you when he reveals his truth. That is what you do. So it's not a rejection of judgment at all. If you could not judge, you couldn't do anything. I wouldn't know whether to cross the road or to stay on this side. I wouldn't know. So there's a green light or red light. Well, what's the difference? Well, I have to make a judgment. Does it matter whether I go on a red light or a green light? Well, you try it yourself and try the experiment. I think anyone with any experience at all will judge it's better to go with the green light and to stop at the red light. And you're judging there. That's a judgment, right? So make a just judgment, a true judgment, a real judgment on the basis of what justice is. And God is just, right? So you can see how this will dovetail with Christian truth. But so he presents this as an explicit attack on the poets, and more than that, the poetic understanding of the poetic of education in the ancient world, which he does simultaneously. Though I go back to what I said, he's talking about, for you who want to be just, don't just depend on what you see with your eyes. Think, discriminate, make just judgments. Romans 12 verses 1 and 2. What does it say in Romans 12 verses 1 and 2? Does anyone memorize the passage?
Romans 12.
Yes, verses 1 and 2.
Present your body as a living sacrifice.
That's at the end of it.
Be not conformed.
Good, the pattern of this world,
Transformed.
but rather be transformed by the renewal of your mind. No, you're right. Before that it says, offer up your bodies as a living sacrifice so that you may holy and acceptable to God. Now, present your bodies. Your bodies. So your bodies were important in Christian truth. It's not just your minds. But offer up your bodies as a living sacrifice, because it's not your body ultimately that matters. But that needs to be transformed. So your bodies are no longer your ultimate good. So he agrees with Plato on that. But he also talks about the renewal of the mind. No longer be conformed to the pattern of the world. Well, what's the pattern of the world? It's believing falsehoods about the gods. Falsehoods that our society teaches us, such as the social justice movement. I think it's a falsehood myself, because they don't ever explore what justice is. You've got there's no doubt about injustice. That's not the dispute. But what is social justice? It's a challenging thing to explore. Yes, sir.
Well, I agree with what you're saying about social justice and that sort of
Not everyone does, and I understand that. But
yeah, I'm just saying, as in, like, how would you articulate the idea that, like, it isn't justice at some points?
for sure.
Because it is, like, the arguments are, oh, let's not let the rich get what they want. Or
Which they tend to do.
yeah, exactly. How is that why?
That's why there's a sense of injustice, and the sense of injustice is, in some cases, or maybe even often, I don't know, justified. So the injustice is real, but is it a social injustice? Well, they're talking about a sort of a rank, and then it's going to be on the basis of identity groups and so forth, right? And for me as a Christian, I have serious problems with the idea of an identity group that excludes some and marks people, because I don't think their human nature is connected to their skin color or their sex or their nationality. I don't think that's the basis of my human nature. My human nature is that I bear the image of God, and so do you, and so does she, and so, right? They all bear the image of God. Well, that's what we have in common. The injustice that we experience is also a common injustice. It doesn't matter whether I'm black, white, male, female, whatever. So it's just or unjust, but it's not social. Like that attenuation of justice is problematic, and it also creates a division, and it makes it into a political thing and a political agenda. And at that point, it's moved away from the aim of creating justice to it's a power motivation. In other words, it's just like the Sophists. So the argument is that there's power and privilege, and that's a bad thing, and the way we're going to rectify it is getting power and privilege for ourselves. Well, is that just, or is that just a power move? I see it as just a power move. And it's a naked power move. It's not a desire for justice at all. It's a desire for power. That's not Jesus' motivation. I think you can address the injustices in society without buying into the cultural Marxist social justice movement. But I've lectured on this topic, by the way, if you want to see on my YouTube channel, I talk about it. No, I do. Go on for over an hour, particularly about social justice. But I don't want, that's not the purpose of this here. Purpose of this here on this course in literature is because this idea of the challenge to the poets is really important for later studies. It will be referred to repeatedly, and the poets will be upset that Plato, whom in general, if you're a literature professor or a poet or a writer, you tend to love Plato because he's talking about the good and the beautiful and the just, and you think that's what literature actually does. It presents those things in an appealing way. That's why I went into literature, actually. That's why I decided to study that. I thought it presents philosophical ideas in an appealing way. So it's not either or. He presents it as either or. Plato, I don't think it has to be. And my proof of that is that the most influential Christian writers of the 20th century were two men that I teach, Lewis and Tolkien. They're not philosophers. And yet they can be defended by philosophers, and philosophers tend to think there's a lot of richness here, and it's presented, though, in a story. Anyway, and the Bible itself often presents truth in that way, if you think about it. 2/3 of it is narrative. Why would God present his truth in narrative if he could just present it in the way the philosophers look at things? He could have done otherwise, surely. But he didn't. So I think that we need to take the genres of the way in which the Word of God is presented as truth seriously. Anyway, but that's my Bible is Lit course. So this is all just a way of roping you in to study literature, of course, because it's my motivation for everything. Not really. But that's now remember, the Republic is the ideal city-state. So it's called the Republic, by the way, but in Greek it's the polis. Republic is the Latin word. Polis is the Greek word. It's just the city-state, which he thinks is a larger representation of the individual mind, because he has the idea of microcosm and macrocosm. And everything, if it's just here, it will also be just there. So there's not one standard of justice. There's justice is justice. And it looks differently here, but really it's the same thing. So there will be a hierarchy in the Republic, because he thinks there's a hierarchy in the human soul. The reason is at the top. The passions are at the bottom. The passions, the body, leads us to do all sorts of things. We lust after things rather than loving the good. We lust after what's wicked. But on the political stage, there's no doubt what this sounds like, quite frankly, is a tyranny of the philosopher kings. But this is a metaphor for the individual. I reiterate that. Comments or questions about this? I realize you've just handed in essays, so you're a little tired, and that's one of the reasons I didn't have you read lengthy things this class. It was so that you could listen to me talk. And I wanted you to think at the same time, though, which is hard work. I mean that genuinely. Thinking is a thing that takes time, and more than time, it takes a lot of energy. And it's a muscle that you need to exercise. And you will. And you are already. By the way, at the end of first semester, you'll be exhausted. This is exhausting. My experience is anything like just. Comments or questions? I don't have a whole lot more to say about this at this stage. Yes.
I'm trying to understand how he viewed the polis.
The polis?
Yeah, as in like
The city-state.
and like as an individual, and then.
Okay, so I'll backtrack a little. I probably should have said something about this. So in Athens, where he's writing this is one city-state. There are others like Corinth and Thebes and so forth. But in Athens, all of the Greek city-states assumed and were, in some sense, requiring slavery to exist. So slaves could not be involved in the political life. They could not be. They were not admitted to it. Why? Because they were concerned with bodily maintenance. They were concerned with just living, and they labored. They acted in some ways no different than animals. They were concerned with bodily nurture. That was necessary in order to let men go around and talk all day. If they didn't have food on their plates, they'd have to go out and get food on their plates, but that somebody else was looking after that for them. So it was all based on, the Greek city-state was based, dependent on slavery. The whole ancient world was. Not just the Greeks, every culture actually. Some means of the laborers. And the laborers would be representative in some ways of the body. Like if you don't eat, you're going to die. Right? You need physical nurture in order to do the higher things like philosophize or politics. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean, even though those things are necessary, that doesn't mean that they're the most important things. Because the most important things are the pursuit of the good, the true, the just, the beautiful. At least so says Socrates. And Aristotle will even say it even more plainly. He says that there are only two ways of living. There is the bios theoreticus, or the vita contemplativa, as they'll say when they come to Roman times. There's that, or there is the political life. And the Romans will call this the vita activa. But that's it. The bios theoreticus is the life of the philosopher, the life of the mind. That's a way of living. Aristotle sees it as totally legitimate. This is a real way for a human being to live. This is also a real way. It's a practical, active, deliberating over how you're going to preserve the state and enhance its wealth, enhance its honor and fame. Those are two forms of life which are worthy of being called human life. Now, who is not admitted to either of these two things? Slaves are not admitted to it, so they don't really have a human life according to Aristotle. He's not saying they're not human, but the life that they live is unworthy of these types of lives which are worthy of being. Who else is not admitted to this? Well, children. Who else? Women. Slaves, women, and children do not have a life worthy of living. Now, he's not saying they should all be dead. He's saying that they don't live the life that that's worthy of a human being. And so we should pursue these things. And these are necessary for that. By the way, the reason that women can't is not because they're irrational, although some do say that in the ancient world. It's because they are caught up in the laboring process. Their bodies partake of labor when they get pregnant and have children and so forth. So they are more tied to the maintenance of life, the sustenance of life, the nurture of life. They're physically more tied to that, whereas men are more liberated from that by the virtue of the fact that they don't have to bear children. I'm not saying you should like this, by the way. I'm just describing it. Yes?
They've all found a different vein, so I just want to make sure you're done on this one.
So this explains when you talked about the political realm and how he's assuming that they're in the polis, you're going to be either like Socrates or you're going to be like a politician, and both of them, or like Aristotle or like Plato, and those are worthy. Now, come the Christian era, these will be taken over by this is the church and this is the state. right? So there's a place for the church in teaching what is theoretical or contemplative. Will contemplate God, will teach theology, will teach those things, right? And you do this. So the vita contemplativa is what happens in the 7 liberal arts. You're taught there. It's a contemplative life. You do it for a time, and then you go out into the world. And in fact, in the medieval period, it's so much entrenched that the firstborn, who's the one who's going to inherit the family estate, because it's the name, right? Firstborn son, goes into politics. Firstborn. The secondborn can go into the church, because the firstborn is going to inherit the family estate, and if the one who goes to the church is going to do that, then he's going to lose all the family wealth. So don't do that. So if you're the firstborn, you are not going to go into the life of the clergy, which Martin Luther did, by the way. He was the firstborn. That's why his father was so angry with him. He was a wealthy merchant. His father spent his whole life paying for him to go to be educated, and now he was going to not only was he not going into the world, he was going to lose everything his father had gained. Just contextualize. But that these two lives that Aristotle delineates held in the church, and to some extent still do to this day. By the way, there is a sort of life which Plato regards as contemptible, and that is of the merchant, the person who works in order to gain money. This is contemptible. All they're looking to do is gain wealth. Why would you do that? That's the means to do better things. But if your sole interest is in gaining more money, then it shows that your passions and your appetites overrule your reason. I'm just telling you what Aristotle thinks. This template holds for 1,800 years, actually over 2,000 years. So when in modern politics there's enfranchisement and the vote goes to, we have politicians that we elect. The politicians at first made no money. They were not given a salary, because to work for a salary would be contemptible in politics, and you wouldn't be pursuing the good of the state. You'd be looking to line your own pockets. And you have to be liberated from those concerns in order to go into politics, and it's a base motivation to do it for that, and there's an honor for those in politics. So, and among other things, to this day, to accuse a rival of being a liar in Parliament is unacceptable. If you've been caught out in a lie, you should resign. Nobody follows this code of honor, needless to say, in our day. But there's an expectation in the parliamentary system that they will be truthful, and if they're caught in a lie, it's a scandal, you resign. Because you're not doing politics the way we conceive our system to be. You're acting like the Sophists, and you're pursuing the power and privilege and interests of yourself and your group. Well, now we've descended into tribalism. This is no longer the Christian democratic tradition of old. Yes? I tangent. Now you got your own tangent or whatever. You can flick the lights on, by the way, at the back. Sorry.
It seems like
Thanks.
Socrates and Plato, philosophers, they esteem reason and logic to be the highest thing. And I can really see that in terms of justice, because you need to think about things and not just be led by what seems right or feels right. But do you think it can be just as misleading to lean on your own understanding of things and
Yes.
reasoning?
Yes.
And that can be just as dangerous, and it can be just as or more so misleading, because we're told in the Bible to not lean on our own understanding.
Yeah, so what Plato and Aristotle seem to not fully recognize is the power of sin in deluding people that their rationalizations are reason. So this seems reasonable to me when really it's just rationalizing bad behavior. I think they don't tend to recognize that clearly enough.
I just think that, from a Christian perspective, being so heavily weighted logic, you're going to quickly come to know that God's ways are higher than your ways, and sometimes it doesn't look just, or it doesn't measure out to seem just in our way of viewing it.
I think there's some truth in that, but that's chiefly in relation to the quintessential divine act, which is the crucifixion. That's the way God's ways are not our ways. In the act of grace at the cross, where he substitutes his son for our sins, that is his way, not our way. We don't do that. He calls us to do that, but we don't do that. But in perceiving what justice and injustice is, it's clear that Scripture defines what those things are and demonstrates what they are. And they're seen in the Ten Commandments, among other things. Here's how social justice ought to be done. Do these things and you'll live. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? What's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The second one's just like it. So that is to do justice, is to do those things, yes. But that doesn't mean we can't reason about it. I've used a reasoning argument, right? And you're trying to think along with me, and that's the capacity that we use. So I think Plato's point and Aristotle's point is valid. It's just insufficient, because they will not see the point of charity. Charity is giving somebody what they don't deserve. They don't do that in the ancient world. They give people exactly what they deserve.
That doesn't comply with
it doesn't fit with human reasoning. It would never occur to Socrates or Achilles that he should do something for his neighbor and love his neighbor ahead of himself. It would not occur to him. Those are God's ways. They're not our ways. And yet the world's transformed by God's understanding when we see Christ give up his life for his enemies. Not just his friends, but his enemies. There are very few people that will give up their life for another person, full stop. But for their enemies. And we are God's enemies, each one of us. That's the point. So this is why God's ways are not our ways, but we are to be like that. I still think the whole idea of thinking is what defines human nature. It's one of the marks of the definitions of human nature. The most important one is the one that Christ himself reveals. But remember, Jesus is the Word of God, the Logos of God. That word is potent. He's the Logos of God. And by that word were all things created. Right? Which means that God speaks things into being, and we can think about them. We can use logic. We can understand them. We have minds to understand. So it's not only right to understand them, we're called to understand them using our minds and our words. Otherwise, Christians would never have bothered with the education system that marked the university and transformed the Western world. They wouldn't have bothered. They would have stayed in the way things used to be. They would have been conformed to the pattern of the world. There would have been no progress. There would have been no science. Those are all Christian developments, by the way. Modern science is a Christian endeavor, down to the ground. They thought it was God-honoring to know more about the world that God created. That's what they thought. That's what I think. That's why I'm here, rather than making wealth for myself on Bay Street somewhere or something like that. Or whatever. You get my point. Helpful? We're doing things in sequence here, right? We're doing it chronologically. There are problems with Plato and with Aristotle and the ancient world, but the truths that they teach, I think, are visible to us to this day, and they do influence Christian categories. And that's also a legacy that cannot be denied. And we can't get rid of reason and love God, because even love has to be differentiated from lust or hate. How do we distinguish the two? We have to use your minds. You must. That's an aspect of it. Otherwise, I'm loving you. Really? How do we distinguish that there? You can't just say it's written in the Bible, but you need more than that. You have an explanation. Because otherwise, okay, I'll give you an illustration. Otherwise, we can't differentiate between first-degree murder, where I want to take your life and I seek to do it and then I do it, and what we call manslaughter, which is you ran out in front of my car and I hit you. We call it manslaughter. In both cases, somebody's dead. Why do we think that the one is worthy of a harsher judgment than the other? Because we're reasoning. We're looking at context. We're differentiating. We're looking at precedent. All of these are using our minds. The mind is the thing that distinguishes us from the animal, and so is the use of speech. On my YouTube channel, I talk about the kingdom of speech, and that's in relation to Darwinism and so forth as well, which they have no explanation for to this day. Darwin evolutionists have no explanation for the thing that distinguishes mankind from the animals, namely speech. They don't have it. Animals don't have it. Can't explain it. And yet they say there's a continuum of life all the way up. Makes no sense to me. Anyway, we're done for today. Next time, we will move on